The final brushstroke on the commissioned portrait felt like placing a period at the end of a perfect sentence. The $5,000 piece, destined for a gallery showcase, was my best work. The deep crimson and gold hues weren't just paint, they were 60 hours of my life, meticulously layered. The quiet pride in my studio was shattered by the doorbell. My sister, Lena, stood there with her 10-year-old son, Ethan. "We were in the neighborhood," she said, already brushing past me, her tone the same entitled melody I'd known since childhood. I should have seen it coming. The pattern was as familiar as the sting of their past financial manipulations, but a naive part of me, the one that had just won a measure of justice in a different courtroom, hoped things could be different. Ethan's eyes immediately locked onto the vibrant, wet canvas. "Don't touch anything, sweetie," Lena said, her voice a hollow echo of warning as she scrolled through her phone. I turned for a mere 10 seconds to fetch drinks. The sound was a wet, tearing crunch. I spun around to see Ethan, a smirk on his face, dragging his entire hand through the center of the painting, obliterating the subject's face in a smear of ruined color. The shock was a physical blow. But it was Lena's reaction that truly sealed the moment. She glanced up from her screen, let out a light laugh, and said, "Oh, lighten up. He's just a kid exploring his creativity. You can always make another one." The words "make another one" hung in the air, toxic and familiar. This wasn't about a child's mistake. This was the same foundational disrespect I'd endured my whole life. My time, my effort, my creations were always disposable in their eyes. The $2,100 they'd stolen through identity theft, the graduation they'd ghosted, it was all the same currency of neglect. But the cold, sharp fury that rose in me now wasn't the helpless anger of the past. It was something else, something forged in previous legal battles. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked at the ruined $5,000 canvas, at my sister's dismissive shrug, and in that silence, a new, unshakable resolution was born. This time, the consequences wouldn't be paid by me. Watching Lena usher a smug Ethan out of my studio without a real apology was like watching a rerun of my entire life. The script was always the same, only the props changed. This time, it was a ruined canvas instead of a stolen graduation or a drained bank account. As I stood there, the smell of turpentine and betrayal thick in the air, the memories flooded in, each one a stark confirmation of the pattern I was finally ready to break. When we were kids, if I spent weeks building an intricate model castle, Lena would accidentally sit on it, and my parents would console her for being upset. My achievements were quiet, expected. Hers were festivals. She never faced a consequence, not once. That was the foundation on which everything was built. This wasn't even the first thing Ethan had destroyed. Last year, it was my vintage camera at a family barbecue. He'd thrown it into the pool while Lena laughed and said, "Boys will be boys." The year before, he'd scribbled over the first edition book I was reading. My anger was always met with the same weaponized phrase, "You're too sensitive." They had turned my legitimate feelings into a personal flaw, a convenient way to dismiss any accountability. My art, my passions, my property, it was all treated as less important than Lena's comfort or her son's unchecked impulses. My parents had always bankrolled her life, her bad decisions, while I worked 2 jobs through college. The $2,100 they stole via that credit card was just the financial version of the same principle. What was mine was ultimately theirs to use or discard. But the woman cleaning paint off the floor now was not the same girl who cried over a broken camera. That girl had been through the fire of a courtroom once already. She knew what evidence looked like. She knew the weight of a legal document. The cold fury I felt was clean, sharp, and focused. This wasn't a messy emotional storm. It was a calculated understanding. Lena's dismissal wasn't just an insult about a painting. It was an assumption that I would, as always, absorb the cost. She was financially dependent on our parents because the world had never demanded she be anything else. And in that moment, I realized I had the power to become that demand finally. This wouldn't end with me just swallowing another loss. This would end with a bill, legally delivered, and a lesson long overdue. The precedent had been set in my previous victory, and I was more than ready to build upon it. The morning after the destruction, I didn't call my sister to scream. I didn't call my parents to plead. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began to build my case with a calmness that would have been impossible a year ago. My first search was for the small claims court limit in our state. I found it quickly, $10,000. My $5,000 painting fell well within that boundary. This was familiar territory. The path was already worn from my previous battle over the identity theft. But this time, I wasn't starting from zero. I knew the language, the forms, the necessary steps. I documented everything. I took dozens of high-resolution photos of the ruined canvas from every angle, the deep gashes in the fabric a permanent record of the intentional act. I dug out the signed commission contract and the client's payment receipt for the full $5,000. I even found the text thread where Lena had asked to pop in, establishing her presence. Then I made the most important call. I dialed Mr. Davidson, the lawyer who had guided me to victory against my parents. "We have another situation," I said when he answered, my voice steady. "It's my sister this time. Her son intentionally destroyed a commissioned artwork worth $5,000, and she's refusing any accountability." There was a brief pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the nod of recognition. He remembered the patterns. In his office later, I laid out the evidence. He reviewed the photos, the contract, and listened as I explained the history of excused destruction. "The value is clear, and liability is straightforward for intentional damage, even by a minor where the parent was negligent," he stated, his tone all business. Then he looked up from the documents. "But you know, with your sister's history and the blatant negligence, we could argue for more than just the replacement value. We can file a civil suit beyond small claims. We can sue for triple the amount, $15,000, for intentional infliction of emotional distress and the loss of future business from the client. It's a stronger message." I didn't hesitate. The woman who had nervously sat in the same office over a credit card fraud was gone. "Do it," I said. The decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. I wasn't just seeking compensation for a painting. I was seeking a definitive legal end to a lifetime of being the family's cost-free casualty. Mr. Davidson's guidance was no longer just legal advice. It was the validation of a new reality I was creating for myself, one where my work, my time, and my boundaries had a price tag that the law would enforce. The courtroom air was cold and still, a stark contrast to the storm of arrogance radiating from my sister, Lena. She sat at the defendant's table, wearing a smirk that told me she still believed this was a family squabble I would eventually drop. She had laughed when she was served the papers for $15,000. She was not laughing now. Mr. Davidson stood with a calm authority that commanded the room. He presented the evidence methodically, the photos of the vibrant painting before and the brutal, smeared ruin after. He entered the signed contract for $5,000 into the record. He outlined the history, how this was not a childish accident but the latest in a long, excused pattern of destruction. Lena's lawyer argued it was a simple accident, that the value was inflated, and that I was being vindictive. Then came the moment that shattered my sister's entire defense. Mr. Davidson presented a new document. "Your Honor, we have discovered that the defendant holds a comprehensive homeowner's insurance policy that explicitly covers property damage caused by dependents, up to $50,000. The air left the room. Lena's face went pale. This policy would have covered the full $5,000 loss with a simple phone call. The defendant was not unable to pay, she was simply unwilling. She chose to let her sister absorb the entire financial and emotional burden rather than file a claim and risk a minor increase in her premiums. This was a conscious choice, demonstrating a profound disregard for the plaintiff's livelihood and well-being. The judge's eyes narrowed. Lena tried to sputter an excuse, but the truth was undeniable. The gavel fell. The court finds the defendant liable for the full $15,000, plus the plaintiff's legal fees, the judge declared, her voice firm. This ruling accounts not only for the destroyed property but for the intentional infliction of emotional distress and the demonstrated pattern of negligent parenting. Lena's composure was shattered. A loud, choking sob escaped her as she realized our parents couldn't save her from this. The public humiliation was complete. The entitled sister who had never been held accountable for anything was now being held accountable for everything, in a room where her tears held no power. I felt no joy, only a quiet, profound vindication. The law had seen the truth I had lived my whole life, and it had finally spoken my name. The $15,000 wasn't just money, it was capital to build a new foundation. I didn't just replace the ruined painting, I transformed my entire studio. I bought a professional-grade easel, installed brilliant new lighting, and invested in top-tier materials. Every time I walked into that renewed space, it was a physical reminder that I had turned their destruction into my upgrade. The court's victory was more than a check, it was permission to invest in myself unapologetically. Meanwhile, the judge had mandated that Lena complete a 12-week parenting course, a public and humbling admission that her boys will be boys attitude was, in the eyes of the law, a form of negligence. For the first time, an authority figure had labeled her parenting not just a difference of opinion, but wrong. The most unexpected shift came from my parents. The legal loss was a shock to their system that my years of quiet suffering never were. My mother called, her voice hesitant. "We never realized how deep this went," she said, a fragile acknowledgement of the lifetime of favoritism I had endured. They were finally forced to see the pattern I had been pointing to since the credit card fraud and the abandoned graduation. They didn't fully apologize, but the dynamic was irrevocably broken. Their golden child had been legally proven to be in the wrong, and they could no longer pretend otherwise. The family narrative had been rewritten, not by me pleading, but by a judge ruling. Standing in my new studio, surrounded by the tools of my passion, I felt a peace I had never known. This journey wasn't just about a painting. It was about the final, definitive establishment of a boundary that could not be crossed. I had learned that when you stop arguing your worth with people who refuse to see it, and instead, you demonstrate it through unshakable action and the full force of the law, everything changes. I was no longer the overlooked daughter or the disrespected sister. I was an artist, a businesswoman, and a woman who had taught her entire family the cost of disrespect. The price was $15,000, plus their illusion of control. Some losses are actually gains in disguise, and some battles aren't about winning against others, but about finally claiming the victory of owning yourself. If your family has ever treated your passions as disposable, as something less important than their own convenience, then you know the unique pain I'm talking about. You know what it's like to have your work, your art, your heart, treated as something that can just be made again. If you've ever been in that position, I need you to tell me your story in the comments below. Let me know that I'm not alone in this. And if you've ever had to stand up for your creative work, if you've ever had to legally protect something you built with your own hands from the very people who should have been cheering you on, then share your city with me. I read every single comment. This story, from a ruined canvas to a $15,000 ruling, is part of a bigger journey about turning destruction into triumph. If you want to see more stories of justice reshaping toxic family dynamics, then you need to subscribe to this channel. We are a community that believes in boundaries, in self-worth, and in the power of the law to deliver what simple conversations cannot. So, subscribe right now and tap that bell icon. You don't want to miss what happens when people stop complaining and start building a case. Your own moment of empowerment might just be one video away.